Welcome. Let us begin, as we always should, by acknowledging that First Church is located in the traditional and unceded homelands of the Massachusetts and Nipmuc peoples, who had stewarded this land for generations before the violent displacement by Europeans, and also recognize that this acknowledgement is merely the first step to disrupting the erasure and invisibility of Indigenous peoples. We must call on each other and our governments to respect and affirm tribal sovereignty and to work with our tribal governments in the restoration, restitution, and land rematriation processes. So in today's panel, we're going to continue the process of learning and unlearning with a focus on the Depression era through the mid-1960s. And when we think about Boston, this is a time period that can be characterized as willful blindness to the experience of minoritized groups in Boston, most especially for Blacks and as well as Jews. And this is also the time period where we see the racial disparities that we see today, particularly the wealth disparities and the residential segregation, become very firmly rooted. So to set the stage just a bit, let's look at those population changes. So the first thing to notice here is the steady growth in the Black population in Boston. Now, much of this is part of the second wave of the Great Black Migration from the South to the North and to the West. Some of this also is the migration of Blacks from the Caribbean as well as Cape Verde. Not shown here, but also important to note, is that there's a tiny non-Black population of people of color, almost entirely Asian, but not wholly Asian, but mostly Asian, that does grow steadily, but never really makes it to even 1% of Boston's population during this time period. Now, another thing to remember is that as we head into the Depression, the United States, led by thinkers and leaders from New England, is hyper-focused on the so-called infiltration of undesirable Europeans. Remember, during this time, Southern and Eastern Europeans, particularly Jews, were legally white, but they were not socially considered white. And this is a really long and complicated but important history that we don't have time to really dig into today. What is important for now is that one manifestation of the fear of being overtaken by so-called hordes of undesirable Europeans involved preventing their migration into the United States. And this was accomplished starting in 1927, when the Johnson-Reed Act went into effect. And that law explicitly limited migration, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, although it is worth noting that there were very large loopholes that were created that many took advantage of. But I point that out because this large decline in the foreign-born white population that we see between 1930 and 1940 is the effect of both the worldwide economic depression, it was a worldwide depression, and the severe restrictions that were created in the mid-1920s that would not be lifted until the mid-1960s. Now, the last thing to notice in the population changes that we see here is that we see the very beginnings of the white flight from Boston. There's a significant decline in the white population of Boston is starting in the early 1950s. Interestingly, when you dig into the numbers a little bit, most of that drop in the white population is found among native-born whites. So what ends up happening is that the proportion of Boston's population that is Black almost doubles. But it's not because there was a massive increase in the Black population, but because there was a significant decline in the white population. Oops. So many of you may know that one of the major drivers of white flight is redlining. For those of you who aren't fully aware, redlining was a practice developed by banks to identify areas that were considered safe to provide mortgages in. The red areas that you see here are the definite no-lend zones, right? And the yellow areas are, we don't really want you to lend in there either, right? And so as you can see here in the Hulk map, the redlining map that you see here, the vast majority of Boston is either red or yellow, particularly the Black areas and the Jewish areas of Boston. Now, bankers did not necessarily do this because they were racist. It's not that they were not racist, they just didn't do this because they were racist. They did this because they're greedy, right? Banks created the redlining map to comply with federal regulations that explicitly prohibited lending in integrated neighborhoods and strongly discouraged lending in urban neighborhoods if banks, at least if banks wanted to participate in the mortgage subsidy programs that were created as part of the New Deal, right? And so we see here, this is on the screen, this is the underwriting manual from the Federal Housing Authority that basically says, don't lend in neighborhoods that are integrated. And by the way, don't lend in older properties, which in particularly the Northeast are entirely urban places. Now, what we have then is between 1935 and 1952, federal law institutionalizing discriminatory mortgage practices that explicitly benefited white people and explicitly excluded people of color and immigrants, as well as, by the way, Jews. Biases and practices that are largely still found today. If you want to learn more about this, I strongly suggest, if you haven't already, reading The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, who does a fantastic job describing how New Deal era housing, employment, and social welfare policies were explicitly racialized. It suffices to say for today that by the time we get to the end of the 1950s, white people were able to take advantage of the GI Bill and FHA subsidies, and they moved to all white suburbs outside of Boston in droves. And this included those previously undesirable Europeans who finally came to be seen as socially white by most people, notably for New England, Italians, and of course, Jews. And there's an interesting story to tell about this, about the Jewish exodus from Boston. As Hillel Levine demonstrates, this began in the early 1950s, and a lot of ink has been spilled trying to explain it. These are two books that you see here on the screen, The Death of the American Jewish Community by Hillel Levine and Lawrence Harman, as well as Gerald Gamm's Urban Exodus, that do their best to try to explain what happened. For many years, a lot of people ascribed the Jewish departure from Boston as evidence of anti-Black racism amongst Jews. And while we cannot discount that because the US culture is thoroughly infused with white supremacy and that would have infected Jews also, there's another part of the Boston Jewish story that is worth remembering that helps us understand why Jews wanted to leave Boston in the first place. So what most people don't know about Boston is that it was Boston, the city of Boston and the Boston region, was an important center for fascist, or what we today would call white nationalist, and explicitly anti-Semitic propaganda. Starting from about the mid-1930s, the two most important organized white nationalist efforts centered here were the America First movement and the Christian Front. Now, the Christian Front is the more important of the two for our story today, as it was inspired by and took direction from a Catholic priest from Michigan, Father Edward Coughlin. Now, this is a complicated story that upsets my cat very much, as you can probably just heard. What is important to know is that Father Coughlin's radio program and magazine, weirdly named Social Justice, that's the height of irony there, that the radio program and the magazine explicitly promoted anti-Semitic white nationalism and actually was viewed by the national government, by the federal government, as essentially propaganda for the Nazi Germany. in Boston, there's a gentleman named Francis P. Moran, who was the local head of the Christian Front. And he executed a very successful campaign promoting these ideas, organizing people, holding public rallies and meetings, organizing militias across Massachusetts, and generally inciting violence, primarily by Irish American Catholic youth against Jews. And it turns out also, if you want a little bit of juiciness, a little bit more juiciness to it, that Moran may have also received funding from a Nazi agent operating out of the German consulate, at least until it was forcibly closed in 1941. Now, the existence of white nationalist or fascist organizing, American fascist organizing in Boston, was one of those things that the Boston's leadership just refused to see as a problem, despite it being very much out in the open. So from the late 1930s through October of 1943 in particular, Jewish residents, especially young people, were regularly attacked and assaulted. Jewish businesses and homes were regularly vandalized, and none of this was a secret. It was reported to the police, it was reported to the mayor. The police did nothing to investigate these crimes. They tolerated street violence against Jews, and not infrequently, police officers themselves engaged in the abuse of Jewish victims of street violence. And it wasn't just the police that tolerated it. Everyone did, and particularly the media. There's a great master's thesis on this topic, specific to this idea of why did the media, Boston media specifically, not acknowledge this. And the author of that thesis asked every daily newspaper, there were 8 daily newspapers in Boston at that time, for any stories that they might have ran between January 1940 and October 1943 on either the US fascist movement or the anti-Semitic disturbances in Boston. And they all came back with, sorry, we have no articles on that topic in that period of time. Not a single story of the experience of threats or violence or vandalism against Jews was printed in any of the 8 daily newspapers in Boston until after October 1943. So what happened in October 1943? 2 articles from publications outside of Boston detailing the attacks on Jewish residents in Dorchester specifically were written. One was an article published in a New York City newspaper called PM, and the other article was in Time magazine, basically copying what PM had already reported. What seemed to get everyone's attention was the description of just complete disregard by the police, by the mayor, by the governor of complaints of anti-Semitic harassment and violence. And the governor is important here because during this period of time, it was the governor who appointed the Boston Police Commissioner. So when these stories first began to break in October of 1943, both the mayor and the governor simply refused to acknowledge it. Governor Saltonstall himself initially insisted that, nope, there were no racial problems here, so quit bringing it up. Mayor Tobin very loudly, apparently as was his form, maintained that this was just normal juvenile delinquency, quit making a big deal out of it. Now, eventually, the governor did begin to take this very seriously, well, somewhat seriously, and he ordered the police commissioner to investigate and to do something, anything, whatever, just do something to end the attacks on Jews in Dorchester and Roxbury. And curiously, at least from what I had access to and could find, there was no mention of Mattapan, which was also a Jewish community where similar attacks were happening. Boston's Mayor Tobin, however, never got over the accusations, and he was even more offended when public officials and religious leaders in Boston began to just barely acknowledge that there was, in fact, anti-Semitic violence occurring and that something needed to be done about it. Interestingly, as we see here on the screen, the threat to Boston's reputation is a common way of framing these refusals to acknowledge this problem. It's as if looking anti-Semitic was more important than anti-Semitism itself. Now, there was eventually a response by both religious entities, community-based organizations, and the governor. Governor Saltonstall eventually replaced the police commissioner, however, only after his failure to stop his own police officers from abusing Jewish youth, leading to a very high-profile court case at the end of 1943. There was a decline in street violence, roughly starting in the sometime in 1945, although the threats and attacks on Jews never really went away. And indeed, there was a spike in the early 1950s of vicious anti-Semitic attacks in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, as well as in Chelsea. But starting roughly 1945, overt anti-Semitism went out of fashion. Particularly, so this is the end of World War II, the horrors of the Holocaust were becoming clear to everyone, and Jews began to be tolerated as white. As a consequence of that, they were able to take advantage of housing opportunities to get away from the institutionalized bigotry they experienced in Boston. Bigotry that included, I came to learn, being forced to endure daily Bible readings in public schools as required under state law, because that was a thing up until 1963. So Jews, especially those who could take advantage of the GI Bill, were able to leave Boston along with other whites. Blacks replaced Jews in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, and were then kept in those neighborhoods by both discriminatory housing policies and everyday anti-Black bias. Now, one result of this is that Boston public schools became even more segregated, right? So they had always been segregated, but now they were more segregated, particularly after the 1954 Brown v. Board decision. Now, as we've talked about in previous learning community events, Boston public schools had always underfunded the predominantly Black schools. But this got worse over the first half of the 20th century. So by the time we get to the mid-1950s, the average white student received 42% more funding than the average Black student. Black parents, notably Ruth Batson, had been organizing for more resources for predominantly Black schools for decades. Batson ran for public school committee in 1951, which at that time was elected entirely on an at-large basis. And of course, she lost because white supremacy. But through her involvement in the NAACP, she increasingly challenged the Boston School Committee to desegregate schools, to hire Black teachers, and to put in place what today we would call anti-racist curriculum. Now, this all came to a head in 1963. This was the year that Louise Day Hicks became the chair of the school committee. It's also the same year that the NAACP demanded that the school committee recognize the de facto segregation of Boston public schools. And of all the things that they were demanding, simply acknowledging the problem was for the NAACP the most important thing. But following in the footsteps of Boston elites that came before them, Hicks and the rest of the committee basically engaged in outright denial that the schools were segregated, despite their own data showing otherwise. A statewide commission published a report in 1965 finding that 20% of Boston public schools were 100% white. 22% of Boston schools had 50% or more of the students being non-white. And in those 45 schools where it was 50% plus non-white, it wasn't like it was 55-45. It was predominantly non-white. As a matter of fact, whenever they found more, when they looked at just the schools that were where 50% or more were non-white students, it was mostly over 90% non-white. So, but the Boston Public School Committee, led by Hicks, refused to accept that the schools were segregated. They argued that it wasn't the schools that were segregated, but that the neighborhoods were segregated. Now, that wasn't not true, but the school committee set school boundaries in such a way as to create segregated schools. And in addition to that, Boston Public Schools provided buses for white students to attend predominantly white schools, something that the NAACP found in their research in 1963. So it was, this segregation was not simply because of the segregated neighborhoods, it was institutionalized in the school processes themselves. Now, when the Boston Schools Committee was not busy denying the problem of segregated schools, they were also busy blaming Black communities for their poor educational experiences. According to, excuse me, the superintendent of Boston Public Schools, Black communities were culturally deprived and filled with juvenile delinquents with unwed mothers. Now, what you see here on the screen that refers to culturally deprived immigrants is not referring to foreign-born folks. Remember, that was on serious decline during this period of time. It was referring to Southern Blacks migrating from the South. So this willful blindness to racial disparities on the part of Boston's white leadership, and particularly the media, was not only found in relation to public schools. Whites in Boston had long ignored employment discrimination and the violence targeting Black residents of Boston. Boston's newspapers were filled with stories of threats to the safety and well-being of Blacks outside of Massachusetts, filled with stories of the segregated schools in the South, while totally ignoring the same things were happening right here in Boston. And so now we set the stage. This all sets the stage for the Black liberation movement of the late 1960s and forward to come to the most conservative liberal city in the country. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Professor McCannon.
Thank you so much, Nina. Wow, so a lot of challenging history about what.
Oops. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Nina, for that really helpful picture of the challenging state of Boston in our period. I'm going to share my screen to put up my slideshow, and then we'll get going. Can everyone see this okay? Yeah, okay, I see some nodding heads. So I'll be talking in one sense more broadly than Nina, as I'll be talking about the entire country. In another sense more narrowly, because I'll be looking specifically at Unitarians and to some extent Universalists. I'll talk both about the national movement for Black liberation and about what's going on in Unitarian congregations. The context for this nationally is what's sometimes called the Lawn Civil Rights Movement, which ran from the so-called nadir of race relations at the beginning of the 20th century up to the rise of Black power in the late 1960s. Within this movement, there are at least three competing and overlapping strategies. Booker T. Washington's strategy of gradual uplift through education. As we saw last time, that's the strategy that in earlier decades, Unitarians had been especially supportive of. Marcus Garvey's strategy of claiming a sense of Black nationhood, either in Africa or within North America. And finally, W.E.B. Du Bois's call for immediate, full social and political equality. One unintended consequence of Du Bois's vision of full equality is that it could marginalize the experiences of poor and working class African Americans while centering the so-called talented 10th who were able to gain access to historically white institutions. Unitarians were very enthusiastic about the Du Boisian strategy, but really contributed to this kind of talented 10th problem. They were especially eager to welcome Black professionals and highly educated Black activists to their congregations. This was also a time when the historically Black churches were somewhat disengaged from politics, which meant that many Black activists were looking for a different religious home. It is also, as Nina said, the time of the so-called Great Migration, when the reign of racial terror in the South was leading many Black people to migrate to northern industrial cities, where they were more likely to encounter Unitarians. I'll talk about a few of the major organizations of the law and civil rights movement and how Unitarians fit into the story. Last time I talked a little bit about the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Du Bois was the visionary. His two most important white allies were both Unitarians, John Haynes Holmes and Mary White Ovington, who was a member of Holmes's congregation, the Community Church of New York. Another organization that came a little bit later was the Congress of Racial Equality. This grew out of a group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was an organization of religious pacifists, most of whom were also socialists. During World War II, they became convinced that there was no way to build socialism in the United States without breaking the structures of white supremacy. They also became convinced that Gandhi's struggle in India provided the model for racial justice work. So CORE was created as a spin-off of the Fellowship of Reconciliation to do Gandhian racial justice work. They were the Congress of Racial Equality because they believed they could only advocate for integration in the larger society if they practiced it in their personal lives. A lot of them lived in interracial ashrams. When they staged sit-ins at segregated businesses, they did so in groups that were deliberately balanced 50-50 to model what an integrated society could look like. In 1947, CORE sponsored the Journey of Reconciliation. The Supreme Court had declared segregation unconstitutional in interstate bus travel, so a half-white, half-Black group of activists traveled across the Upper South. One student activist who participated in the Journey of Reconciliation was Meadville Lombard student Homer Jack. Jack was from Rochester, New York. He grew up in a Jewish socialist family and was introduced to Unitarianism by the local minister David Reese Williams and by Williams' daughter Esther, whom Jack later married. This is a familiar name to many of you because David Reese Williams' nephew, Reese Williams, was the minister of this church for 40 years. Back to Homer Jack, his first ministry was in Evanston, Illinois, and during those years, this is the 1950s, he repeatedly traveled to Montgomery, Alabama to support Martin Luther King. Later, as the UUA's Director of Social Responsibility, he coordinated UU involvement in the Selma March of 1965. Of the major civil rights organizations, the Urban League was the least political and most focused on directly addressing urban poverty. It was an organization of social workers. Whitney Young, who headed the Urban League at the time of the 1963 March on Washington, had grown up in a Black professional class family, attended social work school at the University of Minnesota, and worked his way up the ranks of the Urban League. At every step of his journey, he and his family worshiped at Unitarian congregations. They also worshiped at African Methodist Episcopal congregations. This is a really important and common pattern from the 19th century right up to Whitney Young's time of Black Unitarians being dually affiliated in order to maintain a connection to the Black churches that are so important for the Black community. A very different Unitarian story involves Robert Williams. Williams was an 11-year-old boy in Monroe, North Carolina, when he witnessed a policeman. This particular policeman happened to be the father of future Senator Jesse Helms, knock over a frail Black woman and drag her to jail. He was radicalized by that experience and by his service in World War II. And when he returned home in the 1950s, he was determined to oppose such indignities in his hometown. He joined a newly created Unitarian fellowship, preached there on the Montgomery bus boycott, and led an NAACP chapter that gained national attention when two white men were acquitted after sexual assaults on Black women, and Williams declared that it was time to stop lynching with lynching. This was 1959, and his words triggered a debate about whether nonviolence was a sacred value or simply one of many tactics that could be used in the fight for freedom. His increasing radicalism eventually led him to exile in Cuba, where the picture that you see on the right was taken. So you can see lots of different styles of advocacy for Black freedom found a connection to Unitarianism. But what about Unitarian congregations? At least a few congregations were eager to welcome the well-educated Blacks who were at the forefront of civil rights activism. True integration of congregations never took place accidentally. It required deliberate choices, more or less along the lines that CORE pioneered, of people deliberately trying to get together in roughly numerically equal groups with a balance of power. This was the model that the Community Church of New York began to practice early in the 20th century. Much like our current efforts to center the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color UUs, Community Church deliberately chose to constitute a team of ushers that was 50% Black at a time when the congregation itself was only 20% Black, to ensure that every Black visitor to the church would experience a friendly welcome and would have a sense that they could belong as part of this church. During the same years, Community's minister, John Haynes Holmes, encouraged the creation of a Unitarian congregation in Harlem, led by the Jamaican minister, Egbert Ethelred Brown, who I gather you all heard about in your sermon this morning. That church was a major center for Black activists in the NAACP and the Socialist Party. But because its members were not wealthy, it struggled to achieve financial independence, and the national denomination was not interested in investing in a significant way in this particular project. Unitarians were also keenly aware of an ambitious experiment in desegregated religion taking place in San Francisco. This was the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples, created by idealists affiliated with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and CORE. The basic idea was that it would be easiest to integrate a congregation if you started fresh, outside existing denominational structures, with an integrated ministry team. Howard Thurman, who'd been the dean of the chapel at Howard University, was the Black lead minister, and his model ensured the thriving of that congregation right up to the present day. That, in turn, inspired a denomination-wide conversation. In 1952, American Unitarian Association President Frederick May Elliott created a commission on intergroup relations. They asked, are we providing the leadership in intergroup relations that we should? Are the few non-whites in our churches merely tokens? Or do they represent the beginning of a real pattern of interracial integration? As you can see, this report is the great granddaddy of our own Commission on Institutional Change. And when I read it, I noticed both parallels and divergences from our conversations today. On the one hand, they warned Unitarians not to think too highly of ourselves. In spite of the high average level of intelligence and democratic idealism among Unitarians, they wrote, our problems of intergroup relations inevitably have much in common with the problems elsewhere in society. This is probably a good moment to say that while Nina was speaking, I looked it up, and the Governor Saltonstall, whom she mentioned as not paying attention to challenges in Boston, was a strong Unitarian leader. On the other hand, while they were kind of calling us out for not thinking too highly of ourselves, the report also lifted up the now discredited ideal of colorblindness as something that they said Unitarian congregations should strive for. Another difference between the Commission on Intergroup Relations and our own Commission on Institutional Change is that the former commission was mostly white and almost all male. The picture that you're looking at is all male, but Lillian Smith was also part of the commission. Its two Black members were Ernest Collymore, he's the second from the left on the upper level, who was a dentist whose family integrated the congregation in White Plains, New York in the 1920s, and Howard Thurman, who was not a Unitarian at all, but a strong ally. There's a significant irony to the work of this commission. It fell squarely in the middle of the fellowship movement, which was the most successful church planting campaign ever undertaken by Unitarians. The logic of the fellowship movement followed the same white supremacist logic that Nina was showing us with all those maps. Denominational planners carefully studied demographic trends and encouraged the creation of lay-led fellowships only in neighborhoods with high percentages of college-educated white people, the people they thought were most likely to want to be Unitarians. So even as the denomination was starting to think about how to integrate congregations, its actions were locking in a pattern of overwhelming whiteness. The commission gathered information on 170 congregations, and they found that 52 churches, including 6 in the South, had Black voting members, but only 12 Unitarian congregations in 1952 had 5 or more members who were Black. Now I'll quickly tell you about a few of these congregations. I already mentioned the Community Church of New York. You see here an adult education session at that congregation. It was one of 3 New York congregations on the list. The other 2 were the Unitarian Church of Harlem and the White Plains congregation, which Errol Collymore had integrated and where Whitney Young and his family were worshiping during his time as head of the Urban League. The situation in Chicago mirrored that in Manhattan. First Unitarian was a large congregation that made a deliberate effort to welcome African Americans. It was located in Hyde Park, one of the few neighborhoods that was becoming genuinely integrated. 10% of that church's membership were Black. Historian Mark Morrison Reed was a very small child growing up in that congregation at the time of the commission's report. Chicago's Free Religious Fellowship, on the other hand, was parallel to the church in Harlem. It was a majority Black congregation founded by a Black minister who likely would not have been called in the 1940s to serve a white congregation. Louis McGee, that minister, had been an AME minister, a chaplain to Black soldiers in World War II. He became Unitarian after gravitating to humanism. Eventually, he was able to receive positions as assistant minister in historically white congregations, and his departure helped accelerate the decline of the Free Religious Fellowship. The picture that you're looking at comes from All Souls Church in Washington, D.C., another large congregation in a neighborhood with a large Black middle class that took very deliberate steps to welcome Black members. Their religious educator, beginning in the 40s or 50s, was a Black woman who was very energetic about knocking on doors of the neighbors and inviting everyone to come to the church school, whereas you can see they were very intentional about helping kids relate to one another across racial lines. Her work prepared that congregation to be the first major UU congregation to successfully call a Black senior minister. So far we've seen 2 big patterns. Very large urban churches with deliberate commitments to integration and small congregations with Black ministers with predominantly Black membership. First Unitarian Cleveland is a 3rd pattern. Like the DC and Chicago congregations, it had been a center city congregation in a neighborhood that was rapidly becoming majority Black. In 1951, the congregation decided to move to the white suburb of Shaker Heights, but a minority of its members said, no, 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 we want to stay and commit ourselves to the work in the city. So the congregation that shows up as having at least 5 members in the commission's report is the remnant. and you can see a play, a drama that they staged dealing with issues of racial justice. For the next decades, that church was a beacon for racial justice in Cleveland, even to the point that in the 1960s, it turned over its building to the local Black caucus. But numerically, it never managed to thrive. Okay, so what's happening in Boston? 2 Boston congregations are among the 12 that had at least 5 Black members in the 1950s. Arlington Street roughly followed the pattern of the congregations in Chicago and DC. It was the largest Unitarian congregation in Boston, a logical destination for Black professionals with liberal religious views and an eagerness to join white allies in the work of integration. In 1959, Arlington Street called Jack Mendelson, an ethnically Jewish champion of racial justice who had previously been the minister in Rockford, Illinois, which is another one of the 12 with at least 5 Black members. Yet few today would classify Arlington Street with First Chicago or All Souls DC among the successfully integrated UU congregations. And it might be interesting to think about why that was. I think a lot of what Nina shared provides some clues, along with the fact that the Black professional class in Boston, because of this pattern of hostility, was much, much smaller than the Black professional classes in Chicago and in DC. The story of First Unitarian in Roxbury is much like the Cleveland story that I shared. This is one of the oldest congregations in Boston and has a proud Puritan history. In the 1940s, Roxbury became the center of Boston's Black community, and the church chose to stay in place, serving its changing neighborhood. But the numbers never worked out. Membership slipped from 137 in 1954 to 74 in 1965. By that time, the church's situation had become much like that of the Harlem congregation or the Free Religious Fellowship in Chicago. It could not thrive without financial support from the national denomination, and ensuring the survival of majority Black congregations was simply not a priority for the national denomination. Since the 1960s, there have been repeated efforts to create a viable congregation at First Roxbury, but none has been especially successful. And as most of you know, eventually the UU Urban Ministry relocated there to maintain a different sort of Unitarian presence in Roxbury. One more Boston congregation that didn't make it into the list of 12 has an important racial justice story in the 1950s. And I want to thank Daniel Lawler for discovering this, I think, largely forgotten story. And I'm really excited by what Daniel was able to learn. This is Second Church of Boston. As you may recall, Second Church was located very close to Boston University in the building now occupied by Ruggles Baptist Church. Along with First Parish in Cambridge, it was thus the Unitarian congregation most closely associated with student ministry. In 1950, Second Church called a dynamic new minister, Brooks Hale. At the time, Second Church had a membership of 230 people, which made it one of the smaller of the Boston congregations. During the 7 years of Hale's ministry, Second Church more than doubled in size, while all the other Boston congregations basically stayed about the same. So clearly he was doing something right, drawing a lot of new people in. Midway through Hale's ministry, Boston University called Howard Thurman to Marsh Chapel, a powerful example of the potential for integrated ministry. So perhaps inspired by that example, Hale came up with a plan to urge his congregation to call an associate minister with special responsibilities to the student community and make a commitment in advance that that person would be African American. The majority of the congregation was very enthusiastic about this idea. 70% voted in favor, but Hale was surprised by the vitriolic opposition of the minority who opposed it. And it's important to keep in mind that this is a congregation that had more than doubled in size during his ministry. So it's quite likely that much of the support came from new members who were inspired by Hale's ministry, and much of the opposition may have come from the older members. Hale eventually decided that he was not a Black associate minister to the kind of opposition he was experiencing, and he withdrew his proposal, tendered his own resignation, and that was accepted by the church. The result was catastrophic for Second Church. Within a year of Hale's departure, its membership had fallen to below the level it had been at when he arrived. And although it had 2 more ministries, it was never able to really get back on its feet. And as all of you know, it eventually merged with First Church. As you can see, this is a fascinating story about which we still have only partial information. And I hope that some of you may have access to some of the memory keepers that can fill in a little bit more details. I think I'm over time, so I will just briefly say that the culmination of Unitarian efforts around racial justice in this period is the Great Selma March of 1965. A time when Martin Luther King invited white allies to come out in a way they never had before. Unitarians came out proportionately, more than any other historic religious tradition. And 2 Unitarians, James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo, lost their lives as a result of their commitment. This solidified the connection between Unitarian Universalism and civil rights at a moment when the vast majority of UUs, especially in New England, were still worshiping in congregations without a significant Black presence. So the lived reality and the espoused principles were out of sync with one another. And that conundrum sets the stage for what we'll talk about in our final session when we look at the way Unitarian Universalists wrestled with the idea of Black power in the late 1960s. Thanks so much, and sorry for going over time.
Wow. Thank you. This was so much and so many stories still to be told. We want to thank everyone for joining for this presentation. And what we're going to do is give some space to process this. So over the next half hour, we're going to do 2 things. One is you'll be divided up into, if you'd like to join in, the small group breakouts for 15 minutes to really process, ask some questions. And then after that, we'll come back as a whole group and we can have more of a facilitated Q&A. What we're going to ask you to do is to think about, as you get in those small groups, what are some questions that what we've learned has just raised? And if you don't have any questions right now, totally okay. We still want to give this 15-minute space in small group to talk with each other about what we're taking away from all this. How does this connect to us and our lives? What new things have you learned? Perhaps there's a question that might arise from your conversation in your small group. And if you think that you do want to pose a question, this is a great chance in the small group to share that with your neighbor. It'll help us do 2 things. 1, make sure it's really a question, one that ends in a question mark. And 2, make sure that this is a question that really can be asked and answered in this particular space. Here's what we're going to do. In a moment, we'll divide up into 15 minutes to talk with each other and peer review our questions. And then you'll see an invitation that'll appear on your screen where you can click to join with your fellows in a breakout group. And then 15 minutes from now, we'll come back together. When we are in one group, Dr. Nina is going to ask each group to share 1 question of genuine curiosity. And be sure that you have someone designated in your little breakout group to ask the question that you've come up with together, who is asking that question publicly. If you can, please note the room number that you were in. So when it'll pop up, it'll say, Daniel, you're in room 1, because that'll help us facilitate the discussion. But looking forward to seeing you all in 15 minutes. And Barbara's organizing us now into small groups.
I'm just calculating size. Okay, I think I'm gonna hit the button and you should get an invitation.
All right. Thank you, Barb. See you in a moment.